Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Daled. The Mishnah now is going to discuss the obligations to leave Peah for onions. Ha'imahot shel bitzalim chayevot b'peah. The Rabbi Yossi Poter. The Mishnah says mother onions are obligated in Peah, whereas Rabbi Yossi exempts them from Peah. Now, Rabotai, what are mother onions? The Rav explains mother onions are bitzalim gedulim shemanichin otan legadel zera. Mother onions are onions that are left in the ground to produce seeds. And since they are left in the ground for a long period of time, they become barely edible and they're only eaten during emergency situations. Now, this Tana holds you still have to leave Peah for these onions. Now, even though we learned earlier in Perek Aleph Mishnah Daled that food that is only eaten in emergencies is exempt from Peah, this Tana holds, according to Tosfot Yom Tov, the commentaries, that this only applies when the species is eaten only in emergencies. But here, the onion species are eaten always. It happens to be these particular ones that you left in the ground are only in emergencies. Therefore, since the species is eaten regularly, you still have to leave Peah from these onions, whereas Rabbi Yossi exempts it from Peah, because Rabbi Yossi says, since at the end of the day, it's only eaten in emergencies, it's considered part of the rule that it is exempt from Peah, and the Rav Reis Talakha follows the Tanakama that you must leave Peah for these mother onions. The Mishnah gives a final case regarding onions. Malbenota bitzalim shebena yarak. You have squares of onions planted in between patches of vegetables. So you have the vegetable patches are going to block one onion patch from the other. So you have onion, vegetable, that way they're never connected. The onions are always separated one from the next. Rabbi Yossi says, Peah mikol echad ve'echad. You have to give a separate Peah from each and every one of those onion patches, the squares, when you harvest it. Whereas the sages say, me'echad alakol, you can give Peah from one square for all of them. Now, Rabbi Yossi holds it's uncommon to plant onions between vegetables. So he says we cannot consider the vegetables to be part of the onion field. So it falls under the category that we learned in Perek Bet Mishnah Aleph. When you have two species on a field, it legally divides the field regarding Peah. So when you have here onion, vegetable, the vegetable patch legally divides the onion one patch from the other onion one patch. Therefore, each one you're going to have to leave its own corner, according to Rabbi Yossi, as the Rav explains, whereas the Chachamim say you give Peah from one patch for the whole onion field, because the Mifnoshim explain onions last in storage, whereas vegetables do not. That's why we said vegetables, most in general, are exempt from Peah because they don't last in storage. So since these vegetables don't last in storage, they're considered insignificant regarding this larger onion field, and therefore they do not separate it. Chachamim say we ignore the vegetable patches and we consider it one onion field. Therefore, leaving Peah in one onion patch is good enough for the entire fields, for all the rest of the patches. Now, Rabotai, Mishnah Hey continues regarding, we spoke about in the early Mishnayot, how you have a single field that becomes divided when you have separations. Like we said, the irrigation canal, maybe the wall, but those are all physical. Now the Mishnah is going to discuss how you can have a field that has no physical separation, but it's still legally divided into two different fields. If two brothers divided a field that they inherited, right? They give two separate peot, each one from his own field. So you have Rabotai, Reuven passes away and leaves his son Shimon and Levi a field. Now they split the field in half. Each one legally owns his portion of the field. Therefore, even though it's one major field with no physical separation, it's considered two fields regarding the obligation of Peah, and therefore they have to leave it. Because the Torah says, Pe'at Sadicha, your field. Therefore, it makes it, the both sides, you have to leave. One son leaves Peah for his side, and another son leaves Peah for his side. However, the Mishnah says, Chazru v'nishtatefu, if they went back and joined together. So the way it works is that they inherited the field from their father as co-owners, the whole field. They split it up, that now I only own this side, you only own that side. And now they decided to form a partnership, co-owning the entire field again. Chazru v'nishtatefu, nodin pe'achad, they only give one Peah, one corner, because now both of them own the entire field. Jointly, it becomes like one field, and therefore one Peah is enough. Now the Mifnoshim explain that the Mishnah is talking about where they joined together before the harvest began. Because, as we'll see later on, the beginning of the field's harvest is a very critical point regarding the laws of Peah. So here we're going to say that they joined forces and became co-owners of the entire field before they begin harvesting. Now, what's the chidush of this case where chazru v'nishtatfu, they decided to become partners again and they become co-owners in the field? The Mefarshim explain, based off a Gemara in Masechet Chulin, that the word sadicha, pe'at sadicha, when it says your field, it does not exclude jointly owned fields by two people. Why? Because the Torah says of kutzechem et kitzir artzechem, your land, when you reap the harvest of your land. This comes to include pe'ah that is jointly owned. You have to leave in that case as well pe'ah. The Mishnah teaches another case regarding a tree. If two people bought a type of tree that's obligated in Peah, like we learned earlier in the Parak Aleph Mishnah Hey, has to be certain trees, they give one Peah for the whole tree. Same concept, Rabotai, that when you buy a tree jointly, without specifying, we co-own this tree, the entire tree, we both co-own. We're not saying that you own this side, you own this side. We co-own the tree. It becomes joint owners of one tree, thereby leaving only one Peah. However, if when they bought the tree, Reuven said, I'm buying the north side, and you're going to own the south side, then each one has to leave Peah for his own side. Because, Rabotai, the Mishnah is saying, a chidush, not only do fields become divided when they have different owners, but even a single tree, one tree can be divided into two halves, requiring two peot if it has two different owners. Mishnah says, continues, now Rabotai, interesting halacha. If someone sells individual tree sprouts full of fruits within his field without selling a line in between them, what does this mean? The Rav explains, the Mefarshim explain, small trees that one buys in order to uproot them and plant them elsewhere, somewhere else. Now, if you sell these tree sprouts full of fruit within your field, but you're not selling the land between them, the buyer has to give a separate peah from each and every one that he buys, because he's not buying the field, he's buying individual small trees. It's considered, since he doesn't own the land, each tree that he buys is considered a separate field. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, he explains this Mishnah, Ematai, when does this halacha apply? Bisman shel bal hasadeh, aval im shir bal hasadeh unoten peah lakol. This halacha applies when the owner of the field did not leave any tree sprouts for himself, but he sold them all to the buyer. So since he sold only these trees, but he left the land for himself, it becomes like the buyer bought each individual tree sprout. However, im shir bal hasadeh, if the owner of the field left some for himself and sold some to somebody else, Hu noten peah lakol, the owner of the field will give one peah at the end of the field to cover the ones that he sold as well. Rabotai, if you follow in the Mefarshim, they explain, if the owner sells the sprouts before he begins harvesting, then the buyer himself will have to leave his own peah from each one that he bought. Rabbi Yehuda is talking about a case, right? If the buyer comes and buys the sprouts before they were harvested, so each one that I buy is considered a separate land, therefore I have to leave peah for each one. But Rabbi Yehuda is talking about a very specific case. The owner began harvesting, and then he sold the tree sprouts to the buyer. As soon as the owner began to harvest, the obligation of leaving peah took effect at the end of his field, which he eventually will leave. When he sold the sprouts to the buyer, the ones he was selling already had the obligation of peah resting on the owner's part of the field. Therefore, the buyer doesn't have to leave any peah because the ones he bought are resting on the owner's field. So the owner, at the end, when he leaves, because he's leaving some fruit for himself, when he's going to leave peah, therefore he's going to leave peah, and that'll cover everything, even the buyer's portion. However, like we said, if the buyer comes before anything is harvested, now there's no peah obligation that's going to sit on the owner's field. He buys, he gets a new peah obligation on each one that he buys. Therefore, Rabotai, that is the end of the Mishnah. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.